Bienvenidos. That's California for welcome to episode 77 of National Review's Radio Free California podcast. I'm Will Swaim, president of the California Policy Center. You can find my colleagues and me at californiapolicycenter.org, and you can find my friend and co-host David Bahnsen right here. He's an author, a political commentator, and the founder of the eponymous investment firm, the Bahnsen Group. Hello, David.
Hello, Will. Greetings from beautiful but rainy Grand Rapids, Michigan.
Oh my gosh, I forgot that you are at the Acton Institute meeting.
I am, and I am thoroughly enjoying it. I'm missing you. I enjoyed being out here with you a couple of years ago, but I spoke this morning. I gave my lecture on the cultural, moral, and economic implications of the financial crisis, and had a wonderful time. Our National Review friend, Jonah Goldberg, was the keynote speaker at dinner last night. He was fantastic, and as always, great speakers, great information, great reaffirmations of worldview, and a sort of comprehensive reset of principles around ordered liberty. I
cannot imagine Jonah Goldberg in that environment. What did he talk about? How was he?
You know what? Father Sirico reached out to me about booking Jonah some time ago, and I of course told him what I thought the pros and cons of it would be, and he was very comfortable with it and understood it, and it's actually very timely, Will, because as we talked about, and there's an incredible amount of conversation going on right now, often even in the Catholic community, about the fate of classical liberalism and where we believe in the present state of the culture, those of faith ought to rely on a sort of Lockean social construct. And Jonah, while not a confessing Christian or Protestant or Catholic per se, it certainly has a wonderful understanding of the Lockean liberal order and has much good things to say historically and culturally about kind of the fate of of classical liberalism. And so even though it may seem like he was a fish out of water in some constructs, he actually had a really powerful speech, and I think it was thought-provoking for the people here.
Well, I should point out that, of course, Jonah is, I think, at least ethnically Jewish, and I don't think observant, perhaps. I'm not sure.
Is it the name Jonah Goldberg that
tipped me up? That was part of it. But also at Acton, one of the things I loved when you brought me out there was I sat at a table one morning with a bunch of guys from India who were Hindu, ran into an imam during the conference. There are a lot of people representing a lot of different faiths, and of course the spectrum of Judeo-Christian belief were there. And it really was just, I think, a way to figure out how do you integrate faith of any sort, any kind of real faith in a liberal democracy. I loved the conference.
Well, good. So that's what I'm doing. Hopefully the audio is okay. I hate being away from our studio. As we've talked about, we're going to be recording together in studio on Monday for next week's podcast, and then I'm going to be off to New York City for a handful of weeks. So hopefully our listeners right now are putting up with whatever audio challenges we may or may not be having, and looking forward to what we have to talk about today, my friend.
Lots to talk about. Let's start with letters. We have a frequent listener, the esteemed economist Tony Lima. We'll include a link to his website online. Tony writes frequently, as a really close listener. He was responding to our story last week about Governor Newsom's proposal, the deal that he worked out with Capitol Democrats, Sacramento Democrats, to extend health care to illegal immigrants. Tony writes, Gavin says the state will pay for all this with a fine on the uninsured. That's what was in the Affordable Care Act, of course. And I thought the Supreme Court ruled that was a tax, not a fine. Does the law of the land no longer apply to California? And then he adds parenthetically, yes, I know why Gavin is calling it, quote, a fine. Tony's right. The budget does include this provision to fine the uninsured. So if you can't afford it, don't want it, whatever, you will be fined by the state. The fines from people who cannot afford to pay for insurance, ironically, will be used to pay for free health care or subsidized health care for the undocumented up to, I think, age 26. David, thoughts about that issue as we discussed it last week?
Same thoughts as last week. Tony's right. I think that the overall critique of where Governor Newsom's headed with this, Tony's right, you're right, I'm right, and unfortunately, the majority of voters in California on this are wrong.
We also got a letter, really a fun letter from a listener, Josh Hubler. And Josh writes, please don't imagine that I'm her biggest fan, but I have to tell you, it makes me kind of crazy listening to the two of you repeatedly get our junior senator, that's Kamala Harris's name, wrong on the Radio Free California podcast. I respectfully submit that it makes you seem less informed, even if it's a simple mistake. So he helpfully provided us with a link to a commercial of one of her campaigns that is put out to make the pronunciation perfectly clear. And it turns out that the way you pronounce it is like the punctuation mark, Kamala. So meant no disrespect, not a big one for, I love puns and people play with my name too, but I often get called Triumph of the Will by my left-wing friends. I'm not a fascist. Don't tell anybody. So Kamala, yes, we will stand corrected. Let's turn, David, if you don't mind, directly to
I want to jump in on this because you're bringing up a very important subject about Kamala, and that is that I think Kamala. Listen, I wrote back to our letter writer that I have video clips of her husband pronouncing it one way, her pronouncing it a different way, and her campaign manager pronouncing it a third way. So if in the closest orbit of her being are three different pronunciations, then I think you and I can pronounce it however the hell we want. And I will add that if we're going to go with the comma law, I'm going to go with Kami law. And so there we go.
Right after I say we meant no disrespect, you're going to call her Kami law. Yes, so we have a couple of, she was in the news all over the place this week. In one place, we have her rallying with McDonald's workers striking for higher wages. And for me, David, she is talking again about, I think, the lefty myth that all jobs are supposed to sustain an entire family, that they should, if you work at McDonald's, you should be able to support your family. And here's the line that I think represents the conflict in her own thinking. She says at this rally, I worked at McDonald's. I was a student when I worked at McDonald's. There was not a family relying on me to pay the rent, put food on the table. So my question for Ms. Harris, maybe that's a simpler way to get around the Kamala problem. Ms. Harris is, if the jobs were available only at a higher rate, would McDonald's not have simply moved more quickly to the automated service they provide now and cut jobs? Would they have simply said, you know what, we're going to hire people who can work full time. Sorry, Ms. Harris, you're a part-time person because you're a student. So we can't hire you. We need full-time people if we're going to pay full-time rates and full-time benefits. In other words, the jobs would disappear for precisely the kinds of people whom Kamala Harris represented when she was a student.
Well, hopefully you wouldn't actually ask her that question. You would just tell her, because apparently what she needs is an economic education. This isn't something, I mean, look, Will, you're exactly right, but it's not merely an economic difference. There's a really significant moral difference in this perspective. What Kami law would prefer is that these people not have jobs, rather than they be paid a wage, which, by the way, is also still not livable. You're not going to go get an apartment and feed your family and pay for a car and all these things at $15 an hour any more than you would at $8 or $9 an hour. Obviously, 15 is more money, But the whole point of these jobs is that they are part-time for low-skilled laborers, or if they're full-time, it is meant to be a bridge to a different job, often for students, often for people getting more training, but they are reflective of one's economic contribution in the labor force. Some people who work at McDonald's in difficult situations might have a second job. There's any number of things that someone may be trying to solve for economically, but she already revealed the whole point that when she worked there, she was a student. The livable wage thing is a joke because it implies that that's what the purpose of the job is, full-time careerism. What she will do is eliminate the needed cash flow for people that are not able to get that level of work yet in their stage of career, because they will give economic incentive to the companies to replace them with other technologies by cutting back on hours, by cutting back on number of people that they staff in different shifts. And that's the way it goes. So at the end of the day, this is a long litigated issue. And I will tell you that the biggest risk politically to people like Kamala Harris is that she, I thought it was funny. She ultimately risks them finding out that this is all pomp and circumstance. Anyone who goes and gets the $15 minimum wage will quickly find out that they still can't afford rents and so forth without a second job and without another income in the family, or that, whatever the case may be. So unless someone wants to go suggest that the minimum wage ought to be, 25, 30 bucks an hour and all that, look, they're nibbling for votes. And they already have the votes of the people that they're nibbling for votes with. So I don't even understand what this is intended to do. It's terrible politics and even worse economics.
Well, you can imagine all of this, what's the word I'm looking for, extended, these higher minimum wages extended across the board through some sort of executive order or a friendly Congress. And the results, as you say, have long been in on this. What it will do, what this kind of public policy prescription will do, is eliminate jobs at the lowest level for the neediest people who are willing to work. We know this because in Seattle, where they jacked up the minimum wage to $15 and also required of themselves an independent study, the study of the impact of this increase, the study came back, I think it was just last year, 1 year later, showing that the number of jobs at the minimum wage had declined dramatically as a direct response to the higher minimum wage. People simply cut out jobs, automated, moved out of the city. A whole host of things happened. And the thing is that the people who passed this bill in the Seattle City Council, or Kamala Harris, should be required to write personal handwritten notes to everybody who lost a job, begging for absolution. It's just absolutely appalling and heartless and cruel.
So what I would suggest is that if Kamala Harris is going to protest something with McDonald's, that it would be that the McRib is not available year-round.
Mm-hmm. So we have another story. Yesterday, Joe Biden, apparently in a speech, said some things about how he has been able to work together with people he had serious disagreements with. As an example, he pointed out his work on some public policy, successful work on some public policy with people he described as some of the meanest people he'd ever met, but they were still able to get things done. These mean people were arch segregationists still in the Democratic Party at that time. And his statement was, I thought, a really fair one. We have to work together in a country that is divided. And Joe Biden is saying, I am able to do that. Here's the evidence. Well, the lefties in the race and their friends in the media, I'm looking at the Daily Beast article here myself. David, you don't have the advantage of this, so I'll just fill you in. Immediately jumped on this. Let me see. Actually, you do have the link, I think. Oh, good. So the headline is Booker, Harris, Warren. They don't acknowledge that de Blasio's in there too. all tee off on Biden for his, and this is the key word, nostalgia for segregationist senators. Now, nostalgia suggests an affection for, and there was nothing. I'm not a big Joe Biden fan. I think he's probably the most reasonable guy in the Democratic campaign so far. But the idea that he was expressing anything other than contempt for these people's politics is laughable, even in the Daily Beast article that tries to pretend that he is somehow trying to apologize for the segregationist apartheid South. Credit him. Biden came out today and told Cory Booker and others, drop dead. I'm not apologizing. You're playing games. A very Trumpian move, I thought. Not sure that would have happened in the last election among the Democrats.
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of comments. First of all, let's just talk about it politically from a Joe Biden standpoint. This is so early. The first debates are next week. And I think thus far, it's fair to say the Democratic primary has been 20 to 24 people entering, Joe Biden waiting till later in the game. A lot of people thinking he was not really going to get traction. He didn't make a lot of sense. Fears of him being too, old, and not necessarily just in terms of his age, but old as being around in politics for too long, too establishment. Then dealing with this whole thing about whether or not he used to hug women too much or touch their hair or whatever it was, that stuff. And then him entering and everyone saying, oh, geez, we had this wrong, as he quickly jumped to the front, both in the polls and the fundraising. So he enjoyed a couple weeks of saying, okay, maybe he is inevitable after all. And then now people saying, oh, wow, there's a hole in the balloon and air leaking out, and what happens with Biden from here. And then now there was that whole issue, which was really just sort of disgusting on his part, of him flip-flopping about 3 times in a week on his 45-year held position on the Hyde Amendment. And then now we have this whole thing. And so, yeah, I think it's pretty safe to say that Joe Biden's vulnerable. The guy has been unable to make it till the end of June, 18 months before the election, without a gaffe machine, like going and using this analogy to the old segregationist. But I certainly understand your point that he did not actually look. I mean, Will, why bring these guys up at all? Like, there's no better examples that he could use. I'm just thinking pragmatically. Why enter the danger zone and leave yourself vulnerable when you can use any number of other examples about civility and getting along with people? So Booker and Miss Harris are not doing anything different than you would expect them to do. There's a lot of dishonesty, but they need an in. They need some sort of wedge to penetrate the kind of aura of invincibility that Biden's trying to establish. But so I'm not condemning what he said, because I'm with you on what the context really was. But I'm also just wondering about the wisdom politically of a seasoned veteran saying something so unnecessarily stupid.
Yeah, I see your point. And, politically, if you were his consultant, his speechwriter, his campaign advisor, manager, you would have advised him. And according to the Daily Beast story, they all did. They warned him, don't do this. But of course, the reason he's doing it is he's saying, pick the most reprehensible people you can think of. That's not nostalgic. Pick the most reprehensible people you can think of. I have been able to work around those issues to get important work done on other issues.
Okay, but Will, there's one problem. So you're saying he's trying to create a story of how no matter how bad someone is, we can work together. And yet the entire narrative for the Democrats right now is, don't even give Trump oxygen. Don't give him water if he's thirsty. No movement there. So he's not going to be able to run on, I can even get stuff done with segregationists, and at the same time say, I will never, ever work with a Trumpian. But that's kind of the mixed message going on. And so I'm not sure that is a story. You're right that that's what he was trying to say. I'm not disagreeing with you on the substance, but my point is politically it was lose-lose. They don't want the message of getting things done with people you disagree with right now. They want the message of, we're not going to get anything done. We're going to blow the whole thing up. Trump is Hitler. That's their message they want. But secondly, he used an example of something that I think just lent to this aftermath.
My feeling is pretty simple that this little tempest in a teapot, this kerfluffle, really represents the problem, the performative contradiction at the heart of democratic politics. So in foreign relations, they will say, oh my gosh, we must speak nicely, we must be nice to other people. In national politics, it's all about tolerance and diversity of opinion. The moment someone like Joe Biden says, look, we all have to get along even with people we don't like, they jump on him. This is the contradiction. So Joe Biden is saying, I can get along with people. That's what the American public, I think, really wants. They don't want divisiveness necessarily, or they say they don't want it. And Joe Biden points out, I can get along well with anybody, even people I don't like. How much of a solid democratic message should that be? And I think he's right. He ought to come back at these people and point out that if they had it their way, they simply wouldn't talk to anybody with whom they with whom they don't have perfect alignment. That's the problem of the left, is the kind of, gosh, for lack of a better word, the intersectional politics that prohibit anybody from saying anything about anybody else's treasured experience for fear they might hurt them or worse, lose a presidential campaign.
Yeah, fair enough. I agree. I think that we're kind of both on the same page. There's the substantive issues and the political issues, and we're kind of talking about both at once here,
Almost completing our run list of crazy stuff that people say. We have Oakland Mayor Libby Schaaf. You'll remember her from last year when, after President Trump said he was going to round people up, illegal immigrants, the undocumented, she tweeted out and warned in any way she could the residents of Oakland that these ICE raids were coming. Huge uproar following this. Did she interfere with federal law enforcement? Did she stab ICE in the back? Her comment back then was, look, these people, whether they're documented or not, are residents of my community, and I don't like the federal government reaching in here. She's done it again. Donald Trump just a couple of days ago tweets out that he's going to launch full-scale ICE raids. There's going to be millions of people arrested and deported. And Libby Schaaf, mayor of Oakland, comes out and doubles down on her statement that she'll inform residents of the presence of an impending ICE raid. So, David, there are some things here that I think are interesting for conservatives to think about as well, which is the subsidiarity, a concept near and dear to the Catholic heart of the Acton Institute, and that is the power of local authorities to fight back against federal encroachment. Now, immigration, clearly a federal law. People, are demanding across the country both protections for undocumented and arresting and deporting them. Donald Trump has a habit of trolling people like Ms. Schaaf and others. What is the proper response of a local official on this issue?
This one to me is pretty black and white. I mean, despite the fact that I have a more nuanced view on what the immigration laws ought to be and what our overall posture ought to be towards dealing with those who are here undocumented, to the extent that ICE as a federal agency has some particular reason that they are going for various people that would be here illegally, it is a legal, valid, and legitimate action of the federal government, and for a local law officer to play the role of obstructionist in that is a crime. And I think that she should be prosecuted if she were to interfere with the administration of federal law. Now, I also believe that does not mean one is not free to critique the federal law or to analyze ways in which it can either be changed to be better or be administrated better. But to the extent we're talking about legitimate function of government, which we are, I don't happen to believe that ICE is going around. I don't think they have the bandwidth to be going around rounding up people for no reason, that they're just simply here illegally and they have a list of 16 million people and they happen to get 2 of them that day. I think that what triggers ICE's involvement involves more things than merely their presence. But regardless, there is no, I've said this on the podcast before, there's no way that we're going to make progress on this issue without greater trust. And trust cannot be earned when a local lawmaker is explicitly violating federal law and encouraging others to violate federal law. This is showboating by the Oakland mayor, and I think it's shameful.
So we have been accused in the past by listeners of neglecting the other Democrat from California who's in the Democratic presidential primary. That's Eric Swalwell, a Bay Area congressman. He said in an interview the other day that if elected president, he will fire Jared Kushner on day one of his presidency. There's a problem with that, of course. At that point, he should also probably fire Donald Trump and maybe consider marrying Melania, I guess, because she's the first lady. It's just a remarkably dumb gaffe from a guy who keeps, I don't know, he ought to keep a spare of shoes because he's losing them up his own, let's say in his mouth.
I literally, there's no way you can expect me to respond to this, okay? First of all, I don't know if you're telling the truth to our listeners or not that we've gotten criticized for not talking about the other California candidate. If people have really reached out and said, "Hey, how come we're not giving Eric Swalwell a little attention?" I would be happy to. I would be happy to write those people back directly.
No, they weren't complaining in the sense that they wanted this guy to get the status he deserves. They just wanted him to have his comeuppance because he does do things like this. He's another Kamala Harris. You know, he's a person who just generates gaffes every single time he's in front of a microphone. It seems the congressman from the Bay Area cannot help himself and says something dumb. Jared Kushner, of course, an appointee. He leaves when Donald Trump leaves, unless you believe Bill Maher, who says Trump will never leave. It'll require a military coup to get him out. That seems excessive, but you know, Bill Maher. So yeah.
Well, Will, is he gonna fire Mike Pence as vice president?
I'm sure he will have to do that too. He's going to have to clean house. He's going to have to clean the White House.
And you know what I'd do too? On day one, I would say Tiffany is no longer my daughter. I would. This guy. Listen. Here's my pledge. We will continue to talk about Kamala every week, and I will not say another word about Eric Swalwell ever on this podcast. That's my pledge.
And I don't think anybody will be the wiser for his campaign because we're not mentioning it. Hey, we have a story here about a school valedictorian in San Diego County who gets up for her speech, begins the speech rather, predictably with all the cliches, the hackneyed observations about standing on the edge of the future and we are the future, that sort of thing. It was delightfully boring at first, and then she swung into high gear. And David, let's take a listen right here.
You're the most hardworking and caring people that I know, especially in this past year with all the craziness of applying to colleges and coming closer to adulthood. You have been wonderful mentors and role models. Thank you for your endless love and guidance. To the teachers, Madame Rosa, Miss Monaghan, Miss Gomez, Mr. Triolino, Mr. Solomon, and Mr. Aleman, thank you for being so invested in your students' education and well-being. You are the most intelligent, inspiring, and supportive individuals I have had the pleasure of learning from while at SYHS. To my friends, thank you for always being by my side. I appreciate your love and support always, and will treasure the memories we made at this school. To my counselor, thanks for teaching me to fend for myself. You were always unavailable to my parents and I, despite appointments. Only in these past few weeks, with the award ceremonies and graduation coming up, did you begin making your appearance. And might I note, you expressed to me your joy in knowing that one of your students was valedictorian when you had absolutely no role in my achievements. To the staff in the main office, thank you for teaching me how to be resourceful. Your negligence to inform me of several scholarships until the day before they were due potentially cause me to miss out on thousands of dollars. When applying for a work permit, you repeatedly turned me away, despite confirming with my employer and parents that all my paperwork was filled correctly. I've had to escalate issues with staff to an assistant principal various times to reach any sort of solution. To the teacher who was regularly intoxicated during class this year, thank you for using yourself as an example to teach students about the dangers of alcoholism. Being escorted by police out of school left a lasting impression. I hope that future students and staff learn from these examples.
School officials, David, in response to this valedictory speech, expressed shock and surprise that she made it all about herself, and this is a shame that she stole the greatest day of some people's lives, pardon me, from them. David, what do you think about a valedictorian stepping up and taking a swing at the sorry state of public education in California?
I have mixed feelings, Will, because let's just take at face value that it's all true. Then, of course, there's something kind of punk rock about it and interesting and iconoclastic. And so, some of those things can have merit. But then the rest of the article, the criticism was it sort of took away from the experience of some of the other kids and that it had a effect of kind of pointing the finger at her, making it about her. And I'm sympathetic to that argument, too. So I guess to the extent it wasn't just this sort of attention-seeking thing and that it was an indictment of underperforming teachers and administrators, I would like that. But then to the extent that I, as a conservative, tend to be a little less revolutionary than this, I'm a tad uncomfortable. How's that for waffling?
Well, and maybe because it's punk rock, as you say, I like it. I think that she did it in a way that was, I thought, if you listen to it again, she's not railing, she's not shouting. It's only marginally disrespectful in the sense that it speaks the truth in a place where the truth is so rarely spoken. And I think it kind of, these speeches can also be carried out in a way that is wildly politically progressive. I've heard of anti-Trump speeches. However sympathetic one might be to some of these things, I thought this was one of the ones, I don't know, it resonated with me because I find the teachers union control of public education so extraordinary that it's not a shock to me that counselors don't do their jobs, teachers don't do their jobs, teachers are intoxicated on the job. Not a huge surprise. And they'd all be protected by the teachers union.
Fair enough. I understand that. It just, it's a little tricky without having more context of her experience, but I sympathize with what you're saying. I'll say that.
Okay, so now for the let's get to the feature element. Enough of the hors d'oeuvres. Let's get to the main course. That is for me this week, David. June 18th, National Review. Victor Davis Hanson's, I think, tour de force. We remember Luke Thompson so fondly, in part because of his just encyclopedic piece about a year and a half ago on California. Here's Victor Davis Hanson, who was born and raised here as a multi-generational guy in terms of his family's residence in the Central Valley. He still owns farmland up there and writes just some of the most amazing work, everything from ancient history to this kind of piece, which is just contemporary political analysis. America's First Third World State is the title of the piece. And, of course, he's talking about our beloved California. The piece starts off with medieval diseases, gangs, corruption, crime, crumbling infrastructure, out of touch, wealthy elites. It is a powerful catalog of many of the things that you and I have talked about, but it's all in one place. It's almost like the work of our podcast for the last year or so has, been summed up so beautifully. And of course, in his absolutely elegant language, he writes here, in one place, if someone predicted half a century ago that a Los Angeles police station or indeed LA City Hall would be in danger of periodic flea-borne infectious typhus outbreaks, he would have been considered unhinged. After all, the city that gave us the modern freeway system is not supposed to resemble Justinian's 6th century Constantinople. Well, mic drop for VDH. He It says down below, in Californian logic, public defecation butts up against progressive tolerance, so it is exempt from the law. Yet for a suburbanite to build a patio without a permit, for example, costs one dearly in fines. Indeed, a new patio without a permit can be deemed more dangerous to the public health than piles of excrement in the public workplace. Amazing.
Yeah, I like what you said, that it sort of represents everything we've been saying on our podcast. And I would say that Victor Davis Hanson is capturing exactly what we try to do every week, except for he's doing it with wit, erudition, gravitas, eloquence, and intelligence. Other than that, it's the exact same thing that we're doing.
I do like that line where he says, butts up against, because of course he's talking about defecation. I have to believe that he knew what he was writing when he said that. He just goes through the problems of drought. Go ahead, David.
Oh no, I agree. He absolutely knew, and he is a very clever writer like that. He's a brilliant classicist, and I think Victor's at his strongest when he is indicting his and yours and mine home state. And this piece is yet but another summary in the many pieces he's written on it. And so, yeah, I think those clever barbs are one thing. But then the other thing he's doing, and I've seen him do it more and more lately on Fox News, he's also helping to make the case that which is plaguing California is what the rest of the country seems to be working real hard to try to get to. Like that they don't seem to understand that these policies that so many of the progressives are pushing, that they are playing catch up to the things that have gone wrong in California. And so I think Victor is both indicting our state, but also serving up a kind of prophetic warning for the rest of the country.
Well, that's right. He says here I think this is one of the most interesting things. He talks about the fact that, where is this? Here we go. California's universities and popular culture at the forefront of salad bowl and identity politics policies that obstruct assimilation, integration, and intermarriage, the historical remedies for the natural tendencies that arise within multiracial and multi-ethnic societies. In this perfect storm, at the very moment the world's poorest citizens from Oaxaca and Central America flooded into America, de facto rejecting the protocols of their home, their hosts' messaging to them was they should lodge complaints about social injustice in their new home and romanticize the culture they had just forsaken for good cause. Not only beautiful and elegant, literary, but just, when Victor Davis Hanson tells you he has seen this all before and it has played out badly, when he tells you there are historical remedies for the natural tensions that arise in a culture like ours, multiracial, multi-ethnic, you got to listen. And I think the thing, when people ask me, why have you become a conservative? In part, it's because I feel like the left, which used to say, he who does not, citing Santayana, I think, he who does not remember history is condemned to repeat it. It's Victor Davis Hanson telling us to remember history, and it's particularly the antiquated power grid, the lack of investment in infrastructure, the tribalism, the gang warfare, the politicians who are untouched. He talks about going into the DMV and having a clerk when he asked if it's okay, why is she wearing a purple SEIU organizing T-shirt? Her response to him is, you still want to be served. I've been there. I've been in the DMV, and I've seen the union organizing, and I've seen them treat me, just an anonymous face popping up in a line, as if I were just an industrial product they were working on. Not everybody, of course. There are human varieties everywhere, including in the SEIU's domination of the DMV. But the idea that our public workers are arrayed against us, that we're a problem to be managed, is deeply concerning.
Oh, amen. I agree with you 1,000%. So great, Victor's stuff. Everyone needs to be reading Victor on this stuff. I really agree.
Yeah, we'll include this, of course, in the show notes. I want to turn now to an assembly bill, a resolution. It's called ACR 99, states formal resolution condemning conversion therapy. Now, this was in an email. It's not an article, so I don't really have an article to share. I think I forwarded to you the email I got. It was from a guy we both respect, Pastor Jim Doman at Church United. And it is one of the most, again, I don't want to use the word elegant too much in one conversation about writers, but this is one of the most elegant and nuanced approaches to the problem of sexuality in California, in the United States, in the world, in human history that I've seen in a long time, and certainly among the most nuanced from somebody who was considered conservative, right-wing, church-going. And it's from it's actually written not by Jim Doman, but by Pastor Elizabeth Woning, who lives in the Northern California town of Redding, hottest place in California sometimes. And she says that at one time in her life, she says, my life in the queer community, she was a lesbian, self-declared, and says the problem with this one-size-fits-all approach to sexuality, as if we can legislate these kinds of things through the assembly, is that they neglect to understand the very thing they think they're defending, which is the variety of human experience. She says here, ACR, that's the Assembly Resolution 99, leads Californians to believe LGBT is a unified people group with like-minded values and suggests that the LGBT experience is innate and unchanging. However, many of us experience what the American Psychological Association concedes. Sexuality can be fluid. As a result, we find this resolution painfully discriminates against our rights to understand and shape our own sexuality. There was no condemning. In fact, there was this loving embrace and appreciation for the people behind this resolution. And at the same time, an affirmation that each of us is God's particular, sometimes peculiar in my case, creation, and that we bring really unique and varied experience to our lives, and characteristics are different. We're not one size fits all. She says here, we don't exist to denigrate, demean, or even change LGBT people. I should point out, this pastor, Elizabeth Woning, who lives in Redding, with her husband, Craig. She's now married. She's married and has children, and she asks that people attempt to establish dialogue and, when accepted, to humbly keep paths open for all choices, not merely ours. I love this because it's a broadside against the attempt by government to regulate in ways of being on the left and the right sometimes. And considering this came out of a church background, a group called Changed, which is a religious organization, I was deeply touched. I found it a really moving piece. I'm going to try to figure out a way. Maybe we'll just publish it if we can on Cal Policy's website, and therefore make it available to people in the show notes.
Good idea. Good stuff. Thanks for sharing, man.
Anything else you want to talk about, David?
There were a couple other articles. Are we going to save the Dan Walters piece for next week?
Yeah, I'd like to do that if you don't mind. That's all the time we have today. Please subscribe to National Review's Radio Free California podcast wherever you source your podcasts, and leave a review for us on iTunes. That helps others find us. Please email us or follow us on Twitter. You'll find all that information and other fun details in the show notes at nationalreview.com. Go under the podcast and look for our podcast right there. You can also follow us, as I say, on Twitter at the Radio Free CA. On behalf of my friend and co-host David Bonson, we give thanks to show producer Sarah Schutte, technician Brian Tong, assistant Copan Jordan, and to our friends at National Review. We also thank Metalachi, the LA-based mariachi and metal band, for our intro music. La revolución continúa en la semana próxima.